Wow, that was just amazing, wasn't it? Let's give it up for them one more time. That was just unbelievably beautiful. You know, typically the Sunday that kind of sits in between Christmas and New Year's, globally, is one of the least attended Sundays in the church. And since I knew it's kind of going to be a little bit more of an intimate setting this morning here, if it's okay, I'd like to take a risk and just kind of tell you about a really odd thing about myself, if that's okay. And it's this: I have a really weird fascination with stairs. And I think it started sometime between when I was in 6th and 7th grade and my parents bought a house that had indoor stairs for the first time. And I know a lot of people do weird things with stairs. Like, I mean, almost every one of us has known a kid at some point that like sat on the top step, like on their butt and went all the way. I don't know why kids do that. I know that if I tried to do that, I'd never get up. And then there's this other one that like almost every kid I've ever known has done this thing, and there's a picture of it where like they stand on the bottom step and they see how far up they can try to stretch, right? Like, I mean, it's become almost like a business meme of like, don't skip the important steps, or like, let's see how far of a stretch goal that you can do. And while both of those are like fairly normal, my idiosyncrasy with stairs, I don't think is either of those, and it's this. Ever since the summer between 6th and 7th grade, every single time that I have gone up or downstairs, I have always taken my last step with my right foot. I'm serious. You can ask Morgan about this. It's obsessive about it, and I don't know where it started. I don't know if I just like heard, like, you should always get off on the right foot, and so I took it literally, or exactly kind of what was going on there. But it's one of the reasons why, like, if I'm going up to Barbie's office from the lobby, I know that I have to start with my left foot, going up the stairs to finish on my right foot. Or if I'm going back behind the stage, I know that the staircase over here, I have to start with my right foot. And that's not that hard if I've gone up and down the stairs a lot. But it becomes really weird when someone asks me to, like, help them move a couch. And I'm trying to go downstairs, because then I have to do this, like, weird thing where I either, like, double step on a step or, like, skip a step. And it becomes weird, and maybe even a little dangerous. Okay, it felt really good to just finally get that off my chest and tell somebody about that weird idiosyncrasy that I have. But the truth is, I think that most of us, if we're really honest, we have some kind of idiosyncratic thing, right? Something that maybe just like our closest friends or our partners know about us. Right? And maybe we don't even have a good explanation for why we do it. We just do it. It's something that we've told ourselves, the narrative that we keep telling ourselves about why we do these things. A group of my friends often say these are things that we have head-canoned. You know, kind of like we have a canon of stories in our mind, and like we tell ourselves the same stories over and over. And maybe even though they're a little bit idiosyncratic, we still tend to live into them, don't we? And so this morning, what I would like to do is to spend just a few minutes thinking about our idiosyncrasies. And as we are finishing up this series that we've been doing through the month of December called Away in a Laundromat, I want to share with you that I think actually some of those stories that we've headcanoned, even stories that we've headcanoned about the Nativity that may not be true or may not at least be factually there, actually might show us a lot about how to live and how to love ourselves better and how to love other people better. Over the last several weeks, we have been looking at this story of the Nativity story. And we've been talking about some of the different characters and where, if the Nativity would have happened in 2024, where it might have happened. And we kind of made this decision that it would have happened in a laundromat. And so over the last month or so, you have seen different things, if you've been here, where each week we've added different things to the stage. So like at first we had a couple of dryers up here to kind of indicate that the manger was kind of like the laundromat. And then we talked about how maybe our unsheltered friends are kind of like the shepherds who are often over on the sides in the shadows that oftentimes society just misses. Then we talked about how King Herod was kind of this like hateful and vengeant CEO type person who was trying to be so controlling, and they were represented by a suit jacket. And then we talked about the interfaith magi, and we had a coexist flag up here. And then we talked about for example, Mary and Joseph and kind of like the essential nature, the kind of poverty that they were in. And then on Christmas Eve, Philip spoke about the fact that Jesus wasn't the blonde hair, blue-eyed Jesus that many of us have thought about, but maybe would have been someone who would have just shown up in a laundromat. And as we chatted through each of those characters, we added things to the stage each week. Just kind of a little nod to what we were doing. And today, you'll actually notice the stage is the exact opposite. In fact, this morning, I was talking to Michelle right before service started, and she was like, there's no dryers. That was the point, actually, is that as we've been thinking about this, there are often things that we keep adding and adding and adding, and sometimes it's actually helpful to maybe take a step back and see what would it look like on the things when they get subtracted. So as we think through this, what I actually want us to do is see if maybe there's a way that we can use the things that we've headcanoned to teach us a little bit more about ourselves as we move into 2025 and out of the nativity story. And the way that we're going to do this is by looking at one of the nativity stories that doesn't get talked about very often. Most of the time when we tell the Christmas story, we read it out of two books in the Christian New Testament. We read it out of Matthew and Luke, who both tried to provide these like specific details. There's the shepherds and the angels and the stars and all of those things. But then there is this other book that shows up in the Christian New Testament. It's the fourth book of the New Testament called John. And it tells the story of Jesus' birth, but in a very different way. Instead of telling it in a very literal way, it seems to almost be this almost like metaphysical, almost like ethereal way. And so I want to read a little bit of that to you, and then I think we'll kind of work through it as we walk through this story. Because in John 1, it starts by saying this. In the beginning, the Word already existed, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and so the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son. Now, this is John's kind of telling of the Christmas story. And if you look at it, you'll notice there's a lot of things that are missing if we were to try to like base a Christmas play on this, right? There's no magi, there's no shepherds, there's no manger, there's no sheep that talk or anything like that. There's nothing there. In fact, the closest thing is it seems to say that God made God's home here. And the word home there is this word that kind of means tent, like a tabernacle, something that's not necessarily the same way that we think about a home. But I really like the way the Message paraphrase shares this set of text. It says this. It says, he, meaning God, made them to be their true selves, their child of God's selves. These are the God-begotten, not blood-begotten, not flesh-begotten, not sex-begotten. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. I think that's like my favorite version of that. And we saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. And so maybe the notion here is this. Maybe the notion is that God chose to reveal God's self by moving into the neighborhood, so that not by following a set of dogmas or trying to figure out what each detail means, but rather by following the path of the Christ, that maybe we could learn what it looked like to live into our truest self, our most loving selves, our most generous selves. You know, I think that that's oftentimes one of the hardest things about following the path of the Christ is this. When we were young, if you were ever in a Christmas play, it was kind of easy to be in the play. There was a director who said, okay, like the angels stand here, and the magi stand here, and the shepherds stand here. It's easy enough that there's even a little baby that sits in some hay, right? And it's not that hard to like figure out those pieces. But many times for us, or at least this is how it's been for me, is that as I've gotten older, I've thought, you know, those rules, they just don't seem to make sense anymore. Like the rules, when I run into, I don't know, actual people, sometimes those rules that I thought made so much sense when I was younger now don't. And so maybe there is something to the reality that when John says this, that it's about following the path of the Christ, the path of Jesus, that there's something about it that we can actually wrap our heads around. And that's actually the first thing that I want to share with you today, and that's this. That the world is a lot bigger than just what's directly in front of us, okay? And I think this is going to be a key starting point for the rest of the teaching. So I want to kind of sit here for a second and say this again, that the world is a lot bigger than just what's directly in front of us. Of the 4 books that we call the Gospels, like if you opened up the Christian New Testament, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but most scholars don't think that it was written in that order. We redid it later just for randomness sake, it seems like. But the way that it was actually written probably is that Mark was written first, somewhere around 66 to 70 in the Common Era. And then somewhere around 85 to 90, Matthew and Luke copied. And so that's why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar in a lot of ways. But then a couple of decades later, somewhere between 90 and 110 CE, John wrote his, okay? And I think that this is an important starting point because for many of us, if you've ever hung around someone who has been untangling their faith for a longer period of time, or you've sat with a mystic, or you've sat with someone who's been kind of processing this longer, one thing that I've realized, and this is one of the beauties of having an intergenerational grouping of people here, is that sitting with people who have been going through the process a little bit longer often tells you something completely different. That it's not about the rules and the regulations, but it's a little bit more time to think. And I think maybe that's what John did here, is that instead of just writing it out in a chronicling way, he had been able to kind of process it and move forward with it. Father Gerard Sloyan said this about the book of John. I thought it was actually pretty helpful. He says, John does not produce a work of fiction. His narrative is historically based, but its primary goal is persuasion, not a chronicle of events. Does this mean that we have no assurance in this gospel that the events and words conveyed to us really happened as described? They happened, to be sure, but as described, namely in John's narrative world. And that is the truth of this gospel. Given our modern historical mindset, we may think that we are poorer for that. But John was convinced that we are the richer for the way that he told the story. When I was in high school, and this may have been partially because I went to a very evangelical church. It may have been part of the fact that I was a pastor's kid, and it may have been part of the fact that I was on the debate team. But I was really interested in something called apologetics. Yeah, you know what this is. Yeah. In fact, when I was a youth pastor down in Tucson, I had a bunch of kids who went to a private Christian school that kept coming up to me being like, hey, Chris, will you teach us about apologetics? And basically what apologetics was this. It was this idea that, if we just had all of the details about all of the Bible stories, like we knew exactly what year things were done, we could somehow or another prove it to people. Like we could argue people into becoming Christians or something like this. In fact, even some of the words that we use, like I'm going to win someone to Jesus, makes it sound like people are a project or a game, right? I'll be honest with you. At this point in my life, I have zero interest in that. None at all. But I had spent so much of my life thinking if I could just argue and prove these things, if I could just prove that the world was created in 6 literal days, that maybe then I could understand the totality of it. But you know what? I'm not sure that's how any of this works. I'm not sure that I've ever met anyone who was argued into the faith. And part of that I think is this, right? If I could argue someone into a faith, someone else could argue them out of it. Shane Claiborne has often been known to say that people are very rarely brought to the path of Jesus by force, but much more often by fascination. And I think that is so true. That when we start to see this way of love, this path, that maybe we can start seeing something there that unfolds before us. I think maybe John even understood this, that he had thought about the life of Jesus, because while John starts off with this very ethereal notion of where Jesus started, I want you to also see how John finishes his book. It's actually one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible. John 21:25, which is the last verse he writes here, says this: Jesus also did many other things, and if they were all written down, I suppose the whole world could not contain the books that could be written. You see, I think John had this idea that maybe it wasn't that the story was the end point, but maybe it was the beginning. And I wonder what would happen to us if we started to think of the Christmas story not as a finite story, not as a story where it matters where the shepherds or the sheep were, or it mattered if there was an innkeeper or not, or a drummer boy or not, or if the sheep could talk, or if the star did whatever. But instead, what if we saw it as a beginning of the story of how it unfolds for us to live a life that is driven by love? You know, there are dozens and dozens of different ways that the Christmas story gets told. In fact, I have friends who are pastors who this last month or so have been doing entire series on things like making sure there's room in the inn and the innkeeper, which, by the way, is a story that is not in the Bible. It's wild. Like it says that there was no room for them in the inn, but that just meant there wasn't a spare bedroom. But we've created these headcanons, right? Where we've told ourselves these stories, or we told ourselves that there was this little drummer boy, which doesn't exist. It's not there. Or talking sheep, or whatever. And you know what? Let me say this. There was a part of me at one point that would have been like, that's the place to go to fisticuffs. That's the place to throw down. That's the place to say, like, I have the knowledge and you don't. But Paul says that knowledge puffs up, right? That knowledge makes us think that sometimes that we're better than others. And so let me just say this, that maybe if we look at these stories and we think there's something that we can get out of them, even if it's stuff that we've headcanoned, maybe it's okay. If the little drummer story, by the way, in that song teaches you that we've all been given gifts and that we can bring love to people, then awesome. If the story of the innkeeper that says there's no room there reminds us that we should have room for refugees, let's do that, right? Let's not get caught up in the little details. We often say here at the venues that we take the Bible seriously, even if we don't take it literally. And I actually think that's a part of what has allowed so many people to find healing here, is that instead of worrying about things like if creation was 6 days long, we can instead worry about things that make a material difference, like making sure that our unsheltered friends have a place to sleep when it's freezing. Instead of arguing about which translation of the Bible is more right, maybe we can say, like, how generous can we be in our community? How affirming, how loving, how open can we be? It's really a very central component here at the venues that instead of focusing on details that won't matter in 10 years or even 10 seconds, we choose to instead focus on things that will make a tangible difference. And that's why, by the way, Philip was sharing earlier about how important it is that we invest our lives into things that matter, that we can make an actual difference. So as 2024 wraps up, I think it might be helpful for us, once we've now kind of gotten this bigger picture that the world is bigger than just what's directly in front of us, to think about the fact that between now and a little over a week from now, when the kids will go back to school, when the resolutions are made, when maybe we've seen our family and that's been good, or we've seen our family and it hasn't, that maybe there's two things that the rest of this story of John can help us out with, that as we progress to 2025, which, by the way, sounds weird to say, that maybe that we can move forward in a way that is a little bit more loving. So knowing that the world around us is so much bigger, and knowing that that can be very heavy for us, I want to share two more things that come out of this first chapter of John that I think will be very helpful. And the first one is this: it's okay to know who you're not. It's okay to know who you're not. Over the last number of years, I have become slightly better at doing handy person work. But every time I go to Lowe's, I seem to forget this lesson, right? Like I go into Lowe's and I'm like, okay, I need some screws that fit this particular thing. And I go in, I buy a box of screws and I go home. And it's either the wrong head or I don't have the right bit or it's the wrong size or it doesn't hit the right thing or whatever. And so I go back and I buy a second and then a third and then a 63rd box of screws. And I think a lot of that could have just been resolved if I would have just, I don't know, asked. What do I need for this? But there's something about the fact that I can't use my words in those situations that I think many of us might relate to. In John's telling of the start of this Christian tradition of Christmas, he also shares a story in this first chapter about another guy named John. And he's the guy that many of us might have grown up calling John the Baptist. And I'll be honest, I grew up Southern Baptist, and I always thought that meant he was just Southern Baptist. Like, of course, John was there early. That's why the Baptists were better than all the others. But at the time, when John the Baptizer shows up on the scene, a lot of people were arguing and hoping that someone would just come to, like, set everybody free. There'd been this oppression. They'd been hoping that there would be this Messiah or this Savior. And in some ways, I know that there were many of us who were thinking the same thing. Have been thinking the same thing. There are lots of people who keep thinking, like, maybe if we just had the right people in government or just had the right people lead this organization or lead this thing or the other, that we could just figure it out. But the story that John relays here says that John, the other John, was asked if he was the Messiah. And I want you to catch what he says. It says, this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders sent priests and temple assistants from Jerusalem to ask John, who are you? And he came right out and said, I am not the Messiah. Well, then who are you, they asked. Are you Elijah? No. He replied, are you the prophet we were expecting? No. And you know what? I know this is weird, but I think like on an intuitive level, the goodness that is within each of us understands this to some level. Let me show you a proof point of this. A couple of weeks ago, the kids were singing Christmas carols up here on stage. And by the way, they absolutely crushed it. So thank you for those. Yeah, you can give them a hand, the kids and the families who were a part of that. They were awesome about that. But there's a picture that was taken from the balcony that I want to share with you. It's this. It's awesome. But I actually want you to not pay attention to the kids, but I want you to pay attention to the people on the front row with their phones in an awesome way. You know what they did that morning? This was so fascinating to me. Not a single one of the adults tried to get up on stage and try to start singing. None of them tried to steal the spotlight. And you know why? Because they loved their kids. And they understood this radical idea of how amazing things can happen if you don't care who gets the credit. They were willing to say, let me not be the one in the limelight. Let me just showcase the ones who are there. Let me say that my kids are doing a great job. They were showing this unique ability to love others because they wanted them to succeed. When everyone was coming to John and saying, John, are you going to be the one that fixes everything? It might have been very easy for John to be like, look at me. But he knew who he wasn't. You know, as we head into 2025, there will be a lot of people who say to you, you need to do this in 2025. There are these expectations that we're going to post on ourselves, right? Or we'll post them in social media. We'll post back to 2024 and be like, look, 2024 was awesome. And by the way, for some people, 2024 was great, right? I hope that your 2024 was dynamite. And I hope your 2025 is as well. But some people, your 2024 wasn't good, right? What you succeeded at in 2024 was surviving. And so I want to share this with you, and that's this, that there will be a lot of posts soon from people sharing how much they achieved in 2024, but in case someone needs to hear this, it's okay if the only thing you did this year was just get through it. It's okay. It is perfectly fine if that's what you achieve this year. And by the way, it's going to be the same thing next year. Because I think that for many of us, we hit a place where we think that we have to meet all of these expectations from others. And maybe 2025 isn't that year, that it's okay to know who you're not. Maybe 2025 is the year that you set some boundaries for yourself. Maybe it's the year that you say it's okay not to prioritize what other people think of you, or the year that you figure out that there are some things that you've been doing because other people say you should, but they're not who you are. And by the way, if it takes 2024 and 2025 or the rest of your life to figure those things out, that's okay too. We have this entire process, this entire time to do that. You can try on different hats. You can try on different careers. You can try on different pronouns. You can try on different ways that people know you. And that's perfectly fine. You can walk through this learning who you're not. In 1968, James Stewart and his figure skating partner thought they had a real chance to win or to at least qualify to the Olympics. They'd done really well at the past couple of national championships. They'd finished as high as 5th, but they didn't make the Olympics. They missed out in the trials. And so James decided he was just going to go off and do his own singles thing and cut his partner off. I want to show you a picture of her and what she said. She said, I started figure skating when I was 7. Skating is a very, very intense sport. It was a very hard realization that since I was in my late teens, I was never going to get better. I wasn't going to make the Olympic team, and there were younger skaters coming up, so I quit. And I think quitting was a sign to me that I had failed. And I think there are probably many of us that have felt that we feel like if we don't meet up to whatever expectations someone has for us, that we have failed. We look at Instagram and we see someone who's already 10 miles ahead of us and it's only January 1st and we're like, oh my goodness. But sometimes that's not the end of the story. I actually want to read another quote to you from this partner. She said this, my career has been every bit as much about adversity as it has been about passion. coupled with the necessary willingness to accept change. Because that skating partner, her name is Vera Wang. And in 2009, she was inducted into the U.S. National Figure Skating Hall of Fame, but not for the reason that her partner would have been. You see, she realized shortly after stopping figure skating that her passion wasn't what she'd always been told it would be. She figured out that her passion was making wedding dresses. And she parlayed that into starting to make outfits for people who were figure skating. And as people would go on to win the Olympics wearing her outfits, she gained fame in the area where she had often thought that she had been a failure. You know, it wasn't until after she quit that she found her passion. And sometimes the way that we figure out who we are not is because we stop trying to meet other people's expectations or what they deem as a success. It is perfectly okay to know who you're not. And the last thing I want to share with you today is actually the opposite of that coin. And that's this, that oftentimes knowing you're not who others say you are can help establish the truth of who you really are. There's a lot here, so I want to give it just a second to roll around. Oftentimes, knowing you're not who others say you are can help establish the truth of who you really are. The way the story of John the Baptizer wraps up says this. They ask one more time, then who are you? We need an answer for those who sent us. What do you have to say about yourself? And John replied in the words of the prophet Isaiah, I am a voice shouting in the wilderness, clear the way for the Lord's coming. You see, John's goal here was not to be the main character of the story. It wasn't to be the one who came to save everyone or establish a new kingdom here on earth. John's goal instead was to be more like a prophet, to tell people there are problems that are happening. There's a pain point here. Oftentimes, the way that people change is when they realize that the pain of being where they are currently is greater than the pain of changing. And I wonder how often we get so defined by the ways that others think that we should act that we entirely miss defining who we are ourselves. It might be totally possible that the way that we know these things, by the way, isn't something that literally happens. It can be things that we headcanon as we head into 2025. I guess here's the thing. Who cares if the story of the innkeeper is a made-up story? Does it change anything? Probably not. Who cares if your idiosyncrasies include the fact that you start putting up holiday lights in October and take them down in March? That's perfectly fine. And by the way, it's fine the opposite too. If you're the type of person that thinks it's only acceptable to listen to Christmas music on December 24th and 25th, that's fine too, right? It's perfectly fine. John was idiosyncratic as well. The story tells us that he walked around wearing camel skin and eating locust. Yum. And that was before like cricket flour was a thing. Interesting person. But the key thing that John did here, and I could be wrong about this, but the key thing that he did is to make sure that whatever path he followed was a path that shouted love in front, that directed other people to follow the path of love. It doesn't matter how others define you. It doesn't matter how you define yourself or what career you take on. If this is the year that you choose to change your family dynamics, or you choose to change something about yourself, or you choose to change your career, or you choose to not have a career at all anymore, it's perfectly fine. The most important thing through all of those is that whatever choices we make, that it's a choice that screams love forward. As Christmas wraps up, there's only probably one story that even comes close to being as popular as the Nativity around Christmas, and that's the Christmas Carol. It's this story, by the way, that really highlights the importance of headcanons, because the reason that Scrooge changed wasn't because of something that literally happened to him. It was because he was visited by 3 ghosts. And the way that Dickens writes this at the end of the story is so important. He says this, I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all 3 shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons they teach. I guess here's my question for you, my hope for you as we leave 2024 and run into 2025. Is wherever you find truth, that it is God's truth, that there is truth there that we can follow, and that truth ultimately always leads to us screaming love. So that's my challenge for you this week. is that however you don't define yourself or however you do, let whatever it is be something that drives you to push yourself and others towards love. I'm going to pray. There's still about a minute left. If you've had any questions, Whitney's going to come up and maybe ask me one of them, and then we'll tell you all how to dismiss, okay? Let's pray. God of love, we thank you that the path is not a set of rules, but is a person, and that person is love. We pray in the name of Christ. Amen.